Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a version of Egypt that most people never imagine. A place that existed long before the endless dunes, before the postcard sunsets, before the image of a lonely river cutting through an ocean of sand. This was an Egypt filled with life, movement, noise, and creatures so large, strange, and dangerous that simply leaving your village could feel like volunteering for a very bad idea. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to settle in. Maybe adjust your blanket. Maybe listen to the soft hum of a fan in the background. And let's drift together into a forgotten world where the Nile was not merely a source of life, but the center of an ecosystem crowded with animals that have long since vanished from Egyptian lands. Thousands of years ago, the landscape looked remarkably different. The region we now call the Sahara was not yet the vast desert that dominates maps today. Instead, much of northern Africa contained grasslands, seasonal lakes, wetlands, and broad stretches of vegetation that supported enormous populations of wildlife. Rain fell more often. Rivers flowed through places that are now dry and silent. Herds crossed plains where today almost nothing larger than a lizard survives comfortably. To the people living there, this environment was not unusual. It was simply the world. Children grew up hearing distant animal calls at night. Hunters followed tracks through tall grass. Farmers worked fields while constantly watching the horizon because something larger, faster, or hungrier might appear at any moment. The Nile itself was less like a peaceful ribbon of water and more like a crowded highway filled with creatures sharing one vital resource. Every animal needed water. Every predator knew exactly where prey would eventually gather, and every human understood that surviving near the river required a certain amount of caution mixed with optimism and perhaps a little luck. The people who would eventually build temples, monuments, and pyramids first had to learn how to exist in a landscape where they were not automatically the most dangerous thing around. One of the largest animals they encountered was the elephant. Today, imagining elephants wandering near Egypt sounds almost surreal. Most people associate them with distant regions farther south. Yet there was a time when herds moved through areas connected to the Nile ecosystem. They traveled across grasslands, searched for vegetation, and followed ancient migration routes that no longer exist. Seeing an elephant was not a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was simply part of the environment. Of course, sharing space with elephants created certain complications. An adult elephant weighs several tons, possesses remarkable intelligence, and generally wins disagreements by default. Crops could be damaged, paths could be blocked. Entire communities needed to respect the movements of these giant animals because attempting to argue with one rarely produced positive results. Yet elephants also became symbols of power and prestige. Their ivory was valuable. Their size inspired awe. Their presence reminded people that nature remained far larger than any human settlement. Over time, however, changes in climate began altering the landscape. Rain became less reliable. Water sources shrank. Vegetation retreated. Elephants gradually followed greener territories farther south. Generation by generation, sightings became less common. What was once ordinary slowly transformed into memory. Grandparents described animals their grandchildren might never see. Stories replaced experience. Eventually, the elephants disappeared from Egypt altogether, leaving behind only artistic depictions and archaeological evidence proving they had ever been there. Yet elephants were hardly the only giants roaming ancient Egypt. There were also massive wild cattle known as aurochs. These creatures looked somewhat like modern cows, only if modern cows had spent years training for a career in intimidation. They stood taller, possessed enormous curved horns, and carried themselves with the confidence of animals that rarely needed to fear anything. Aurochs moved through grasslands in herds, feeding across landscapes that supported abundant vegetation. Unlike domesticated cattle, they had no interest whatsoever in cooperating with humans. Attempting to control one would have been comparable to attempting diplomacy with a thunderstorm. Early hunters respected them deeply because bringing down an aurochs required coordination, skill, and courage. One mistake could end a hunt very quickly and very badly. Ancient artwork sometimes depicts large hunting parties confronting powerful wild cattle, suggesting these encounters were significant events. Success brought food, materials, and prestige. Failure brought consequences considerably less enjoyable. As centuries passed, humans increasingly relied upon domesticated animals that were easier to manage and considerably less likely to launch someone across a field. Combined with environmental changes and hunting pressure, the aurochs gradually declined. Eventually, they disappeared entirely, not just from Egypt, but from the world itself. Their legacy survives only through bones, artwork, and the distant genetic relationship they share with modern cattle. Then there were the hippos. If modern audiences imagine hippos as amusing animals floating peacefully in rivers, the ancient Egyptians would likely have laughed at that description before advising everyone to stay very far away. Hippos were among the most feared creatures along the Nile. Massive, territorial, and astonishingly aggressive, they transformed ordinary activities into potential hazards. Farmers worried about crops, fishermen worried about boats, travelers worried about nearly everything. A hippo could destroy months of agricultural work in a single night simply by wandering through a field. It could overturn boats, it could injure or kill people. And it did not particularly care whether anyone approved of these activities. Ancient communities, therefore, developed a complicated relationship with these animals. They feared them, hunted them, and at times even incorporated them into religious symbolism. Hippo hunts became important demonstrations of courage and authority. Rulers were often depicted confronting these enormous creatures, presenting themselves as defenders of order against destructive forces. Such images carried both practical and symbolic meaning. Defeating a dangerous animal suggested the ability to maintain stability in a challenging world. Yet even hippos eventually retreated. As the environment changed and human populations expanded along the Nile, suitable habitats became increasingly limited. The animals gradually moved farther south. Areas that once echoed with their presence grew quieter. Another familiar feature of ancient Egypt slowly faded into history. And waiting beyond the riverbanks were lions. Real lions, not statues, not decorative symbols. Actual predators moving through grasslands and hunting large prey across landscapes that no longer exist. Lions occupied a unique position within Egyptian society because they inspired both fear and admiration. Their strength made them powerful symbols of kingship. Their hunting abilities commanded respect. Their presence reminded everyone that humans were sharing territory with creatures perfectly capable of dominating their surroundings. Pharaohs sometimes associated themselves with lion imagery to emphasize power and authority. After all, if a ruler could be linked symbolically to the strongest predator in the region, that connection carried political value. Yet symbolism did not make lions any less dangerous. Encounters remained risky. Livestock could be attacked. Travelers had reason to remain cautious. Communities understood exactly what lions were capable of accomplishing when hunger and opportunity aligned. Over time, environmental changes reduced suitable habitat. Prey species shifted locations. Human settlements expanded. Hunting increased. Gradually, lion population diminished until eventually they disappeared from Egypt as well. Today, only statues, carvings, and stories remain to remind us that lions once roamed beside the Nile. And perhaps no animal represented ancient Egypt more completely than the crocodile. Unlike elephants, lions, or hippos, crocodiles remained closely tied to the river itself. They lived where people collected water, fished, traveled, and worked. Avoiding them entirely was impossible because avoiding the Nile was impossible. Crocodiles mastered patience. They could remain nearly invisible while waiting for the perfect moment. Their existence transformed ordinary daily tasks into exercises in awareness. A trip to the river required attention. Fishing demanded caution. Children learned quickly which areas were safe and which areas invited disaster. Yet the Egyptians responded in a fascinating way. Rather than viewing crocodiles solely as threats, they incorporated them into religion. The god Sobek, associated with crocodiles, represented strength, protection, fertility, and the power of the Nile itself. Temples honored him. Sacred crocodiles were kept and cared for. Some even received jewelry and ceremonial treatment. When they died, many were mummified with remarkable care. It was a uniquely Egyptian response to danger. If something powerful cannot be removed from your world, perhaps the wiser strategy is learning how to coexist with it. As centuries passed, however, even crocodiles became less common in parts of Egypt. Human activity intensified. Habitats changed. River systems evolved. Though crocodiles survived far longer than many other animals, they too eventually retreated from much of the country. By the time later generations looked across the Nile, the animal world surrounding them had already become very different from the one their ancestors knew. The green landscapes continued shrinking. The rains continued weakening. Grasslands slowly surrendered to expanding deserts. One species moved away, then another, then another. What remained was the Egypt most people recognize today. But hidden beneath the sand, preserved in art, carved into temple walls, and scattered across archaeological sites, lies evidence of a forgotten world. A world where elephants walked beside ancient rivers, where lions watched from tall grass, where hippos ruled the marshes, and where every trip to the Nile carried a reminder that nature was never predictable. And perhaps that is what makes ancient Egypt so fascinating. Not just the monuments, not just the pharaohs, but the realization that the land itself has changed dramatically over time. The Egypt we imagine today is only the latest chapter in a much longer story, one written not only by humans, but also by the countless animals that once called the Nile home. Thousands of years passed, and as Egypt grew into one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, the people living along the Nile continued sharing their world with animals that modern visitors would never expect to encounter there. The river remained the center of everything. It provided water, transportation, food, fertile soil, and survival itself. Yet every gift the Nile offered came bundled with a warning label. Ancient Egyptians could never fully separate life from danger because the same river that nourished their crops also attracted creatures capable of ending a perfectly normal afternoon in spectacularly unpleasant ways. Among the strangest animals to appear in Egyptian records were giraffes. Today, seeing a giraffe instantly brings to mind distant African savannas, wildlife documentaries, and photographs where everything looks calm and peaceful. Ancient Egyptians, however, occasionally encountered these remarkable animals through trade networks, expeditions, and contact with territories farther south. To them, giraffes must have seemed almost unreal. Imagine standing beside the Nile, surrounded by familiar animals, when suddenly someone introduces a creature taller than nearly everything around it, with a neck that appears to have ignored all reasonable design principles. Even in a world filled with crocodiles, hippos, and lions, giraffes managed to look unusual. Egyptian artists occasionally depicted them in carvings and artwork, preserving evidence that these animals were known and admired. They represented exotic lands, distant trade routes, and the vast territories extending beyond Egypt's borders. Yet their connection to Egypt also reveals something important about the ancient environment. During earlier periods, regions surrounding Egypt were greener and more connected than they are today. Animals could move across landscapes that later became increasingly hostile due to climate change. As grasslands retreated and deserts expanded, species dependent upon vegetation and open habitats gradually shifted farther south. Giraffes simply followed the resources they needed. Unlike humans, they had little interest in remaining where survival became unnecessarily difficult. Not every animal left quietly, however. Some remained long enough to become deeply woven into Egyptian culture. Among the most famous examples was the baboon. To modern observers, baboons can seem almost comical. They have expressive faces, complicated social lives, and a tendency to behave in ways that sometimes resemble tiny, aggressive politicians. Ancient Egyptians found them fascinating. Baboons appeared in religious symbolism, artwork, and even temple life. Certain species were associated with wisdom, knowledge, and the rising sun. Priests observed their behaviors and occasionally interpreted them through spiritual lenses. Watching baboons greet the sunrise may have seemed meaningful in a culture where celestial cycles played enormous religious roles. Yet despite their symbolic importance, baboons were not cuddly temple mascots. They possessed sharp teeth, unpredictable tempers, and the confidence of animals that rarely cared about human opinions. Keeping them required caution. Ancient records suggest some were imported from regions farther south, demonstrating the extensive trade networks Egypt maintained. These animals traveled enormous distances before arriving in a civilization that viewed them as both sacred and entertaining. Somewhere in the ancient world, a merchant undoubtedly spent weeks transporting an angry baboon and questioning every decision that led to that moment. Meanwhile, the Nile continued supporting extraordinary bird life. Vast wetlands attracted species from across Africa and beyond. Flocks filled the skies. Waterfowl crowded marshes. Hunting birds became both practical and symbolic. Egyptians developed sophisticated methods for capturing birds using nets, traps, and coordinated hunting techniques. Tomb paintings often depict these activities in remarkable detail. Looking at such artwork today reveals something fascinating. Ancient Egyptians paid close attention to the natural world. They noticed behavior patterns. They recorded species. They observed seasonal migrations. Long before modern biology existed, People living beside the Nile had already become skilled students of the environment surrounding them. Birds appeared everywhere in Egyptian culture. Some represented deities. Others symbolized concepts like protection, kingship, or the human soul itself. The famous falcon-headed god Horus reflected this connection between wildlife and spirituality. Falcons inspired admiration because of their speed, precision, and ability to dominate the sky. Watching one dive toward prey must have seemed almost supernatural. In many ways, Egyptian religion borrowed heavily from nature, because nature itself was impossible to ignore. Every animal carried meaning. Every creature revealed something about power, survival, or the forces shaping existence. Yet perhaps no group of animals influenced daily life more consistently than the creatures hiding beneath the water. Fish populations supported communities along the Nile for thousands of years. Fishing provided food, employment, and stability. Entire villages depended upon seasonal rhythms tied directly to the river. But fishing also meant entering crocodile territory. Every cast net, every small boat, every journey across the water carried risks. Ancient fishermen understood this reality completely. Their livelihood required courage mixed with practicality. It is easy to romanticize ancient life when looking at paintings and monuments. The reality often involved balancing ordinary responsibilities against extraordinary dangers. Imagine heading to work each morning knowing a prehistoric reptile might be waiting nearby. Suddenly, modern workplace complaints seem considerably less dramatic. While humans adapted to these challenges, the environment continued changing around them. Slowly, almost invisibly, the green world that had once supported countless species kept shrinking. Lakes dried, grasslands disappeared, animal populations shifted. Some species vanished entirely from Egypt. Others survived only in isolated regions. The process unfolded over centuries, making it difficult for any single generation to recognize the scale of transformation occurring. A grandfather might remember seeing animals his grandson would never encounter. Stories replaced first-hand experience. Memories replaced reality. Entire ecosystems faded from daily life and entered mythology instead. Lions became symbols rather than neighbors. Elephants became legends rather than sightings. Hippos retreated farther and farther south. Even crocodiles gradually disappeared from many areas where they had once dominated. Yet the Egyptians never forgot them. Their artwork preserved details. Their temples preserved symbolism. Their written records preserved observations. Because of this, modern archaeologists can reconstruct aspects of a world that no longer exists. Every carving showing an animal, every painted tomb scene, every preserved artifact becomes a small window into the forgotten Egypt hidden beneath the familiar one. And what emerges from that window is surprisingly different from popular imagination. The Egypt of ancient times was not simply a kingdom surrounded by endless desert. It was a living ecosystem filled with movement, danger, and diversity. People shared the landscape with predators, giant herbivores, reptiles, birds, and creatures that have long since vanished from the region. Survival required adaptation. Communities learned when floods would arrive. Hunters learned animal behavior. Farmers adjusted to changing conditions. Priests transformed wildlife into symbols capable of explaining the mysteries of existence. Over time, the environment changed faster than traditions could fully keep pace. What had once been common became rare. What had once been ordinary became sacred memory. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is how gradual everything was. There was no single day when Egypt became desert, no dramatic moment when animals suddenly vanished. Instead, change arrived, quietly. A little less rain, a few fewer animals, slightly smaller lakes, slightly drier seasons. Year after year, century after century, the landscape slowly transformed itself into something new. Humans adapted because humans always adapt. But adaptation often comes with a hidden cost. Species disappear, habitats vanish, entire worlds slip away so gradually that nobody notices until they are already gone. By the time later Egyptian civilizations flourished beneath towering monuments and magnificent temples, many of the animals their distant ancestors knew had already become rare memories. Yet echoes of that earlier world remained everywhere, in stories, in religion, in art, in the shapes